Hi everyone, welcome to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, the 29th, where we have 3 chapters scheduled: delivering speeches, culture, and audience. And you'll note that at this point, after we complete these 3 chapters, we would have completed the bulk of the text. That's very deliberate because I wanted to put the readings up front so that you would have that information as you are putting together your speeches. And as you know, your first speech will be coming up over the next couple of weeks. And that first speech is an autobiographical speech, a 5-minute speech in which you are going to be asked to share some elements of your life with the audience. Whether you want to give a brief life overview or whether you wanted to focus on a particular time period or a particular element. Part of what I have scheduled for today's class is for you to watch some sample autobiographical speeches from students like yourself, in no way affiliated with GCC, so you don't have to worry that one day your speech will be analyzed. And we will use that as our attendance question for today, your responses to those speeches, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. But perhaps those speeches might give you some ideas of how you could proceed with your own speech. Next class, we have our first quiz scheduled. That will be 20 questions, mostly short answer, but some multiple choice and true false. It will be open book, open notes, so that you can access things like the textbook and our class notes and our class videos. So I'm hopeful that that quiz won't be too challenging because it's open book, open notes. And I'm also hopeful that it's more than just a quiz to show that you've been engaged in the reading and in the class, but also that these are questions of important points for you to consider prior to actually delivering a speech. And you can see that our 3 chapters below and the notes below should also help you in terms of delivering speeches, specifically chapter 10 that talks about delivering speeches. We've been talking about the construction of speeches, the content, but the delivery or the acting piece is just as important. And there are many different kinds of speeches. The textbook talks about the one that we are focused on, the extemporaneous speech. It's prepared in advance and delivered with a speaking outline. Again, you don't want to read the speech word for word because you want to maintain eye contact with your audience, or in this instance, with the camera. But you do want to have some notes in front of you that you can make reference to in the event that you were to lose your place. You don't even necessarily have to use your notes when you are delivering the speech. Just the process of putting together the notes are useful. And I'm going to ask you to submit in those speaking notes on the day which you also upload your speech so that I can give you some suggestions. And if you're curious as to what my speaking notes look like, all you need to do is look below this video, because the notes that I've included are the notes that I literally have in front of me on a piece of paper that I can reference. There is the impromptu speech, the speech that's delivered spur of the moment with no prior preparation. I encourage you to try to avoid that as much as possible. Usually it's something that you are not prepared for, which is why you have to do it spur of the moment with no prior preparation. Perhaps you've been just given an award. I suggest you keep it simple and you keep it short, so that if you do have to deliver an impromptu speech, the shorter it is and the more simple it is, the less likely it is that you will lose focus or make errors. There is the manuscript speech, where you are reading from either a manuscript or a teleprompter. And usually these are very defined situations where you do something like this. For instance, when you are presenting a scholarly article, it is assumed that you would be reading from a manuscript. Or perhaps when you are on television, it is assumed that you will be reading from a teleprompter. Now, I've never had the opportunity to use a teleprompter, but that too requires skill, and things can go wrong, which is why I direct your attention to the notes below, where I have a very brief video for you to watch, 2 or 3 minutes or so, about a teleprompter fail from someone that you would expect to be quite skilled in presentation. Michael Bay, the very famous Hollywood director, talking about his latest movie and some of the technological advancements that he uses. So he knows his subject well. However, what you will see in a very embarrassing moment is that there is a problem with the teleprompter and he is unable to continue. In fact, he rushes off stage. And it's not because he doesn't know the material, but it's because he was relying too heavily on the teleprompter. So I always tell students, don't rely too heavily on the technology because the technology can fail. And this is where the greatness of the extemporaneous speech comes in, that you can ultimately have a conversation. Yes, you have a plan of key points that you want to make, but again, think of it as an important conversation that you would be having with someone. So you want to fill in your key points with unscripted material, as the Toastmasters video had talked about. There also is the memorized speech. It's usually very brief and usually for very formal occasions, something like a toast at a wedding, for instance, where there is no room for error. Again, this is not something that you want to do in a public speaking class. This is not something you want to do with a long speech. And the Toastmasters video also talked about that as well, that the memorized speech is deadly in many respects because, first of all, you don't want to lose your focus, because if you do, then chances are that you will start forgetting elements of the speech. And then also what you don't want to do is to deliver the speech in the monotone, which gets into the delivery, that if you are memorizing a speech or reading a speech, there's a higher probability that you are going to be monotone. You're not going to appear natural or conversational, which is what you want your voice to be, conversational, as if you were having a conversation with someone, which means that you want to do things like vary your volume and vary your speed and vary your inflections so that they are appropriate. And you want to enunciate, which is different than pronunciation. Enunciation means that you are avoiding mumbling, that you are clearly articulating words. Now, pronunciation is probably something you're not going to be able to change, certainly not in a short period of time. So if you are concerned about pronunciation, let's say English is not your first language, you might even want to, at the beginning of your speech, address that if you're having difficulty with my pronunciation, please let me know, or ask me questions in the comment section. Also, you might want to slow down your speed a little bit as well, because that can be very helpful. But you don't want to mumble. And you also want to use silence and pauses for effect. Now, again, this is all a review of everything the Toastmasters video talked about. One thing that the Toastmasters video didn't talk about is proxemics, the use of space, which can be very important in how an audience receives a message. And if you've ever had any kind of interaction with personal space, you'll know that we each have individual and cultural expectations for personal space, about how much or little distance we want between other people. And usually the more intimate the relationship, the less distance that is necessary. But again, this can very much influence how the message is received. Now, again, if you are presenting on video, you're not necessarily going to have the same issues with proxemics, such as what kind of groupings do you want your audience to sit in. But you do want to think about your environment. So you want to make sure that you are recording in an environment that's not too distracting. You're recording in an environment that allows you to show your facial expressions. You're recording in an environment that's well lit enough so that we can see your facial expressions. And again, the camera is close up enough so that we can see your affect display, is what we call it, your facial expression, because this is how mostly an audience will evaluate a message, whether the message be delivered live or it be delivered on video, but especially if the message be delivered on video. Think about things like gestures and whether or not you want to have a full body shot. Just like when you are presenting to a live audience, you may be standing behind a podium, so we may not be able to see your body. But you do want to make sure that you don't appear too stiff, and you also want to make sure that you don't appear too nervous. So you want to avoid nervous gesturing, things like pulling at your hair or scratching. Also, again, you don't want to sit immobile. You want to try to move your face around, or perhaps even show gestures with your hands. The conventional gesture is a gesture that is given meaning based on custom. So the OK sign, for instance, like this that I'm gesturing right now, is supposed to represent, at least from our cultural perspective, meaning that something is good. in Brazil, it could be an insult. So, again, you want to be careful that there isn't cultural misinterpretation. Again, this gesture is given meaning by a particular group of people, as opposed to a descriptive gesture, which shows or describes things like size and shape. So, something this long or this high. And again, that's much more universal. And indicators can express feelings such as slamming your fist onto the podium or behind the camera to show that you wanted to punctuate a particular feeling or emotions. Eye contact. Again, you want to vary that across your audience. If you're speaking live, you want to at least appear like you are uh, varying your eye contact. And if this feels uncomfortable, you can look at the top of people's heads, or you could look at the two corners of the room in the center, and that'll give the appearance of giving eye contact. In terms of the video, then you want to look into the camera, which again is sort of an unusual sort of situation. Again, actors will tell you that they've learned to ignore the camera, but again, that requires a certain level of practice. And both skills are necessary in our current day, in our Zoom world, and in our electronic world. Chances are that you will be presenting not just live, but also via Zoom and also via recording. So all of these skills are useful. They're just different skills. And culture, which was in chapter 4, and this could be an entire class, talks about how, in the most general sense of the word, culture is group membership. I don't know if we could consider a pair, two people, a culture, but certainly we can consider three or more. Usually, when we talk about culture, we talk about demographic groups, these large cultural groups that are identifiable visibly, things like gender, for instance, or things like ethnicity, or things like age. But cultures can be very specific. They can be based on geographic region, they can be based on hobby. For better or for worse, GCC is a culture. I've had many students tell me they've gone to other schools, and that ultimately, not necessarily that GCC is better or worse, but it's different, as a different culture. And by culture, we talk about things like behaviors, the actions that individuals in that culture engage in. So that's usually quite visible and fairly easy to identify. But we also talk about things like attitudes, the emotional responses that individuals within that cultural group have. And that can be something that is changeable over time. If somebody's ever told you that you have a bad attitude, it could change even from moment to moment. As well as beliefs, the things that those individuals within that cultural group think of as true and false. And values. Values are very hard to change, and values include beliefs and attitudes and even behaviors. Values, the things that we see as good or bad in a cultural group. We want to be careful not to stereotype, to overgeneralize, to assume that everyone within that cultural group will share the same beliefs, attitudes, values, and behaviors. But there is a certain predictive element associated with that. So, again, to get back to college students, I can sort of predict things like dress. Usually it's pretty casual. I don't usually see students in evening gowns and tuxedos, for instance. Their beliefs, things that they think are good or bad, I can generally assume that most college students assume that there is a good associated with education, or else they wouldn't be college students. Of course, there could be other reasons why they're college students, but there's a high predictive element that most college students think of education as a good that brings benefit. Things like their beliefs, what they think of as true or false. And I think most college students believe that tuition is too expensive, and so are textbooks. Again, not everybody would necessarily believe that, but I think most college students do. So you can think about even, how ultimately, again, there's a predictive element. And I mentioned GCC. I think about how when I first started working at GCC and I really wasn't aware of the culture, how something like time, which seems to be fixed, is really quite subjective and is oftentimes influenced culturally. I had a colleague who unfortunately passed a few years ago, Dovia Fessi, who would talk about his culture in Africa as compared to the United States culture. He always gave a story about the bus schedules to illustrate his point. That in Africa, the bus Well, let me start with the United States. In the United States, the bus leaves at 2:47 because it needs to be in another location at 2:53. This makes perfect sense to Americans. It doesn't matter whether the bus is full or empty or someplace in between because you need to be at a certain locale at a certain time. In Africa, he says this would be a complete waste of resources. Why would an empty bus leave at 2:47? The bus leaves when it's full. It could be at 2:47 or it could be an hour or even several hours later. And again, this concept seems quite alien to Americans because the idea is that you need to be at a location at a particular time. Well, from the African perspective, you will get to that location eventually. And of course, you might argue, well, I have obligations. I've got school or work that starts at a particular time. And his response would be, well, school or work isn't going anywhere. It starts when everyone is present. It's a completely different way of seeing the world. But again, going to my story about starting at GCC, where I like to attend events and arrive early. And I remember one of my first meetings, I arrived early and no one was there. Keep in mind, pre-internet, wasn't as if I could check on my cell phone to see where everyone was. And not only did the time for the meeting start, but some time elapsed and I was still alone. And I was puzzled and certain that I had made some sort of a terrible error. Somebody finally walked into the room and I asked them what was happening with the meeting, and they laughed at me and they asked, oh, so no one has told you about GCC time, have they? And I said, what is GCC time? And that there was just this unspoken assumption that all meetings started 15 minutes late. And everybody sort of knew that except me because I was new. So basically, after about 15 minutes or so, after the meeting was supposed to begin, the room was full and the meeting began. Of course, I'd been there for a good half hour because I like to get there 15 minutes early. So, and I learned when in Rome, you do as the Romans do. As much as I would like GCC to adapt to my cultural expectations and my individual expectations, instead, I had to adapt to GCC's cultural expectations. So that meant getting to meetings on time, which for me personally would mean getting to meetings 15 minutes early, which satisfied me. So I always use these stories to show how, again, cultural beliefs and values, attitudes, behaviors, it's not about judgment of what's right or wrong or good or bad. It's more about what's accepted within that group of individuals. And usually you want to accommodate to the group rather than assuming the group will accommodate to you. Culture is important in terms of delivering speeches because you don't want to offend your audience. And also, you hope to talk about topics that would be of some interest to that particular cultural group. Understanding again that you don't want to stereotype and overgeneralize. And then lastly, audience, as I was talking about in terms of demographics, those observable characteristics of individuals like age or ethnic background. And I doubt that any of you would ever be in this situation, but the textbook talks a little bit what happens if your audience is hostile. Usually you know when you're going into a situation like that so that you can prepare. Let's say a political rally for the opposition. That said, you might encounter not a hostile audience, a skeptical audience. And I think that many of the suggestions for a hostile audience would work with a skeptical audience. I unfortunately don't have a magic bullet and can tell you that if you did this, then everything would turn out fine. But some suggestions: establish goodwill from the beginning, that there's good intent. Establish areas of agreement, that usually we focus on places where we disagree rather than places where we agree. Use credible outside sources. It's one of the reasons why you will be using outside sources in your persuasive speech, because that lends to credibility. Be professional. In other words, you want to be well prepared and earn your audience's respect. They might perhaps disagree with you. I've always said the point of the persuasive speech is not to persuade everyone to your position, but to gain your audience's respect. So they might disagree with you, but still they can acknowledge that you were well prepared and you delivered a good speech. Use humor. Again, you want to be careful because humor can sometimes be culturally based, but laughter is a great universal. Be multi-sided. Sometimes people just want to be heard. They want to have their position acknowledged. And doing that can oftentimes diffuse skepticism or even hostility. And of course, I had talked about that for that first speech that you will be delivering, that I'm going to be using a template, and that this template evaluates both content as well as presentation. After the first speech, I don't even bother with the template. I just basically take notes. But this template is included in the syllabus and other documents folder. And in terms of content, things like introduction. Are you getting your audience's attention, which could be simply saying hello? And you notice that there's a scale of ranking from excellent to good to needs improvement, and it's none. And then do you transition into your thesis or your point? And then the body. And notice how similar this is in many respects to the construction of an academic paper. Do you have a clear pattern? And are your main points stated? And do you develop those points? Do you have any voice mannerisms? Are you using ums and ahs as filler words in places where you should be silent? And do you have well-chosen words? Again, it doesn't necessarily have to be as precise as a piece of writing, but you want to have language that at least is clear enough so your audience can understand. And then do you have a conclusion where basically you summarize if necessary and you depart from your audience? You tell your audience goodbye. And then there's the delivery piece, and that's what we were talking about today. Things like eye contact. Are you looking at the camera or your audience? Again, that can oftentimes be culturally based. In some cultures, eye contact is a sign of disrespect. So in the Western culture of the United States, we see eye contact as a sign of engagement. So again, these can vary based on cultural expectations. Your body movement, your vocal quality, is it loud enough? Are you varying your vocal inflections? Articulation, again, are you avoiding mumbling? Enthusiasm, even if you don't feel enthusiastic, pretend you're enthusiastic, because if you're not enthusiastic, why should your audience be enthusiastic? So that will help you, hopefully, in terms of thinking about how to put together your own speech. And now what I wanted you to do is, if you will look in the 4th section of our notes, you will see there are 3 sample autobiographical student speeches. And I would like you to watch all 3. And for each of these speeches, for your attendance question, to identify one strength and one weakness from each of these speeches, which is how actually we will eventually proceed with our own speeches as you watch the speeches of your peers, except rather than doing that on a discussion forum, you'll send that feedback to me and then privately on my email, and then I will organize all of that information and then present it publicly to the class so that you can see what the feedback was for your peers. But basically, I'm hopeful that watching these 3 autobiographical speeches will help you perhaps model some of the things you might want or not want to do with your autobiographical speech. The first one is a speech that was delivered to a military audience. We were talking about culture, and definitely the military is a culture. And you can see that the culture will influence the presentation of that particular speech, and probably the response as well. Your second speech happens to be a speech that was delivered, I suspect, for a public speaking class, and it was recorded at home. And the third speech was a speech that was recorded in a classroom. But all 3 speeches, again, will give you different presentation ideas. We can't necessarily evaluate these speeches based on length, because they weren't necessarily trying to fulfill the elements of length that we are, but we can evaluate them certainly in terms of content and presentation. So I'm asking that you watch all 3 speeches and then answer the attendance question on our class discussion forum by Saturday, and that's the 30th at 6 p.m. And of course, if you need additional time, please let me know. You aren't required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read your peers' responses and my responses to those responses. And then certainly if you wanted to add anything to any of my responses or your peer responses, you could. But basically, this would simulate what we would talk about if we were meeting in a live class. And again, if you need additional time for the discussion forum, please let me know and I can grant you an extension. So our next class is a class that's going to be about quiz number 1, as I indicated on some of the earlier chapters, not necessarily all of the chapters that we've discussed. And it also is going to be, or this week will be, the practice session for speech number 1, that I'm asking each of you to contact me prior to when you will be delivering the speech, and ultimately that will give you an opportunity to touch base with me and get some feedback about your topic. And there are a lot of different ways that you can go about doing this. We could interact through email. That's perfectly fine. If you wanted to set up a Zoom appointment, we could do that. If you want to set up a phone appointment, we could do that. And you can have as much or as little practice as you like. If you just want to run your topic by me, and let me know what you're planning on discussing, and you're content at that point, that could be enough. If you want to actually deliver the speech and get my feedback, that's the other extreme, or someplace in the middle. You can also contact me if you don't know necessarily what your topic is, and that's something that we can discuss to try to figure out what you could be talking about for your speech. But basically, that's what your next assignments will be: the quiz. That hopefully those quiz question answers will help you with the formulation of your speech, and also scheduling some kind of practice with me, or some kind of interaction with me about the first speech. And we can also talk about the following speeches too, the informative and the persuasive, but our focus right now happens to be on the autobiographical speech. So I leave you to watch these 3 autobiographical speeches and give some feedback. And next class, I will be presenting the quiz. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.